Hello, everyone. I will talk slowly because I know it takes a minute for people to join, but I would like to welcome you. My name is Susan Weinstein. I'm co-executive director at Families for Depression Awareness. I really appreciate you coming to our live stream on bipolar disorder and genetics. And thank you for taking the time to join. And I look forward to a lively conversation with our guest and with you through the chat. So thank you. Families for Depression Awareness is a national nonprofit organization that helps families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. We focus on providing family caregivers with education, actionable advice, and resources so they can confidently and effectively support their family members or friends living with depression or bipolar disorder. Please do visit our website at familyware.org to access free webinars, expert interviews, family stories, and educational resources. You can keep up to date with Families for Depression Awareness programs and activities through our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn, and also by subscribing to our newsletter. You can do that at our website at familyware.org. During the program, please watch for the link to order free copies of our Adult Bipolar Disorder Stories of Families and Hope brochure. We invite you to request copies to share with family, friends, clients, community organizations, and anyone else you think would benefit from information about bipolar disorder and caregiving and reading stories of lived experience. For today's program, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Neale to learn about the role and maybe the promise of genetics with bipolar disorder. I hope that you in the audience will be involved by providing questions and comments. This is a great opportunity to learn directly from an expert who is very involved in psychiatric genetic research. So let me tell you about him. Benjamin Neale, PhD, is the co-director of the program in medical and population genetics at the Broad Institute and is director of genetics at the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research. He is an associate professor in the Analytic and Translational Genetics Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he directs the Genomics of Public Health Initiative. He is also an associate professor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Neale is strongly committed to gaining insights into the genetics of common, complex human diseases. Dr. Neale's research has focused heavily on the development and application of statistical methods for the analysis of large-scale genomics datasets. He is deeply committed to advancing psychiatric genetics as an active member of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium Steering Committee and Analysis Committee. He studied at the University of Chicago, Virginia Commonwealth University, and King's College in London. He completed his postdoctoral training in Daly's laboratory at Massachusetts General Hospital. In addition to many local research collaborations, he also serves as advisor and analyst to the International Genetic Research Consortia on Psychiatric Diseases. So welcome, Dr. Neale.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for sharing this time to help FFDA provide education for family caregivers. And I just want to make a comment for attendees. From my personal experience, I know that a lot of the terminology and biological mechanisms that we're talking about in this topic can be confusing. So we will provide some definitions in the chat, but if you need more explanation, please do comment and we will do our best to clarify. Okay, you're doing well today, I hope?
I am. It's a nice sunny day here in Boston.
Well, we're very happy for that, believe me. We'll take it while we can, right?
Exactly.
All right, so let's just start off with an easy one. How does bipolar disorder occur in families? Like, what do we know about the role of genes in bipolar disorder? Can we tell bipolar disorder risk from someone's genes?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a somewhat complicated one. So genetics and sort of families and family patterns of, kind of the occurrence of disorders like bipolar disorder has long been used to try and understand and learn about how diseases might come about. And in genetics, we sort of talk about two different kinds of disorders. There are sort of single gene disorders that are responsible, that are caused by basically a single genetic mutation, a single variant that will maybe give you something like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease. These sort of very they're called Mendelian diseases. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are complex traits and complex disorders. And these are things like bipolar disorder or diabetes, or even something like height. So how tall you are isn't down to a single genetic effect. There's not one mutation that makes me 6'3". That's not how that works. There's a sort of large number of genetic variants scattered across our human genome that influence our height. They make us a little bit taller or a little bit shorter. And just by the same idea that there are these many genetic effects that make us a little bit taller or a little bit shorter, there are genetic mutations that slightly increase your risk of bipolar disorder, and also some that slightly decrease your risk. And everyone carries sort of some risk increasing genetic variants and some risk decreasing genetic variants. Now, we know that because we've been able to measure the genome really well. We've kind of developed a whole series of technologies that can tell us exactly the sequence of bases that everyone, any individual person carries. But before we had those technologies, which have really been developed, I'd say, over the last, 15 or 20 years, there were a number of studies looking at twins and families and just asking the question of, if you have an identical twin with bipolar disorder, are you more likely to have bipolar disorder? And the answer to that question is very clearly yes. And it's actually greater if you have an identical twin than if you have a non-identical twin. So, twins come in two kinds. There are identical twins where they share their genome. And then there are fraternal twins that are basically just like siblings born at the same time. And the sibling twins, the co-occurrence of bipolar disorder is much lower in those pairs than in identical twins where the genome is completely shared. And so that gives us a pretty strong sort of empirical data that the scientists have collected over many years to support the idea that there are genetic effects that influence the risk for bipolar. But remember, bipolar disorder is very complex. So is depression. These are complex traits where both genetic effects come together, but also environmental influences. And the environment is as big and complicated as the genome is. The genome's 3.3 billion bases, so really, really long. It's a really long book held in all of the cells of your body. That's actually much easier to study and interpret and understand than when you think about the environment, because the environment includes everything from what your mother ate while you were, gestating as a, preborn little fetus, right? All the way through to the person you stood next to on the T this morning, like I did coming into work on the underground in Boston here. So the environment's a really big, complicated space. Genetics is complicated, but it's actually very measurable and tractable. And so that gives us some hope of trying to understand some things about how bipolar comes to be and how depression comes to be as well.
I have no idea how large a sample would be for this, but are there findings with regard to identical twins raised separately?
Yeah, so for, severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, those numbers are very small and hard to come by. Twins reared apart have been looked at for more continuous traits, so things like height and BMI, and there are lots of examples that the same pattern of identical twins tend to be more similar than fraternal twins, even when they're reared apart, has been done in a number of different kinds of phenotypic areas, and they pretty much completely validate the sort of observations from looking at twins and families when they're reared together, that there's a kind of high degree of similarity with the results that come out of those kinds of studies. But given the fact that bipolar disorder is, rare-ish, right? 1 to 2% in the kind of population is our kind of best estimates, those sorts of things. It gets it makes it a lot harder to kind of find the twins reared apart to be able to do that kind of work. But for something like height, everyone has a height, so it's actually very straightforward to look at those kinds of questions, and it completely validated the sort of genetic contribution to height. And it's not just genetics, right? It's also things like your diet and
Right.
all those kinds of things that also influence that height as well. But there's a big impact of genetic contribution to the variation in height that we see. And same for bipolar disorder.
I mean, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be that many instances where there are identical twins being raised apart.
Yeah, exactly. And I think family and adoption services tend to try and keep identical twins together. Generally speaking, we don't have too many examples of the parent trap, if you will.
I just want to take a second and welcome some of the people who are commenting, Kayla and Valerie and Gwen, and make a note of the questions, and we'll put them in when it seems appropriate. Well, thank you. That's so in a nutshell, bipolar disorder is some genetic component and some environmental component.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So actually, I'll ask this question. Gwen is asking, does bipolar disorder look similar in members of the same family?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, there's a little, there's some familial aggregation within the subtypes as well. So I think if, a family member has a bipolar disorder type 1 diagnosis, their family members are more likely to have bipolar type 1 than they would be otherwise. And then sort of likewise on the bipolar type 2. So just to remind everyone, bipolar disorder type 1 is characterized by manic episodes. And that's basically the only criterion, that you have to have a, kind of florid manic episode. And that gets you into the bipolar type 1 diagnosis. And then bipolar type 2 is, hypomania rather than requiring a manic episode, but also, a kind of episodes of depression, and, typically severe depression as well. And so this sort of, variation in what we call bipolar disorder, which is, I think, important to remember, something that is, potentially helpful in the kind of clinical world of creating a sense of what treatment regimen might look like, or what, kind of course or outcomes for people with these different subtypes might have. It's still, I think, debated about how truly distinct they are and how much overlap there may be. And it's, it's kind of a complicated spectrum rather than a bright line separating these two phenotypes. I think that's another important thing. I often reflect in psychiatry, we have to have a lot of humility because we're doing the best that we can, but these problems are really challenging, and everything is evaluated from interacting with people and their loved ones and talking to them about what they're experiencing. And our tools at getting at exactly what is going on in the brain and how that shapes the behavior and the manifestation of these illnesses is still pretty limited. So there's we're making progress, but there are a certain kind of clinical judgment that has shaped the way we diagnose and structure these different forms of severe mental illness as they, kind of come to be in our understanding of these kinds of diseases. It's, really a challenging space, but nevertheless, there is, it's more similar. It's not a guarantee. Remember, genes are not fate. They do not absolutely prescribe what is going to happen to you in your life all the way through, but they're a big component of your kind of starting point, and a big component of what you might be more likely to develop or less likely to develop. And that cuts across, just not just bipolar disorder, but it also relates to things like schizophrenia or other severe mental illnesses.
And I think that the thing that you point to, it's generally said that it takes at least 5 years from the onset of symptoms, and sometimes 10 years or more, to diagnose bipolar disorder. And I think that some of it has to do with when people are seeking care, because they're probably not seeking care when they're manic unless their family gets them in. But the fact that there's so much of that variation going on, does that affect research too?
Yeah, so the sort of complexities of presentation, the sort of, maybe you present initially with a severe depressive episode, and it takes a little while for the hypomania to present. Those kinds of complications in terms of how each individual's illness presents, what form it takes, how long it takes for the symptoms to sort of fully assert themselves, so to speak, certainly adds complexity to the kinds of work that we do. I mean, a geneticist's job in part is to try and, identify those genetic variants that are giving rise to something like bipolar disorder. And, the uncertainty in diagnostics and the sort of trajectories and the complexities, the sort of, if you have serious mood disruption and then you start to present with psychosis or psychotic features, then you might get a diagnosis of schizoaffective. That's kind of the way the diagnostic categories evolve. But you clearly have, some mood dysregulation, some serious mood dysregulation components, in addition to the kind of question about psychosis. And, that kind of, I would say that everyone that is, kind of dealing with these illnesses, they haven't read the DSM. They're not, picture perfect reflections of exactly what that diagnostic manual is describing. It's, a framework and a set of general, typologies that can be useful in helping to guide care and treatment and all of those important aspects. But the biology is probably more complicated than that. And the sort of different, questions about how these illnesses arise also are likely to be more complicated than just the boxes that exist in the DSM right now.
Well, and y'all don't necessarily agree on the DSM anyway, so. and there's enough of disagreement that every number of years a new one comes out, and then another year or two later, a series of corrections or clarifications comes out. So yeah, it's definitely a moving target.
Yeah, a work in progress, I think, is a good way to think about it.
It's very, very generous. So Kayla has asked, will someone's children have a higher likelihood of inheriting bipolar disorder if there's family history on both their maternal and paternal side?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, generally speaking, the more relatives you have with the disorder, the more likely it is your kids are going to have that disorder. It's not, again, a guarantee. These things are complicated. There's genetic effects, there are environmental effects, but the sort of, in a sense, having multiple individuals in your close family with a given disorder will tend to increase the chances that you have, in the same way that identical twins are very similar genetically to someone with bipolar disorder. They're much more likely to have bipolar disorder than if it's their sibling, or if it's a cousin, or if, a first cousin or a second cousin. Like, as you get further and further out in the family tree, it, sort of drops off in terms of the increase in risk. And by that same notion, the more familial clustering you'll tend to have, the higher the chances will tend to be. But again, these are statistics and probability rather than absolute certainty. And I cannot stress enough that genes are not destiny, that it's not an absolute guarantee that that's the way this is going to play out.
Contributing.
Exactly.
Gwen did ask, what's the DSM?
Oh, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the sort of quote unquote, I mean, I think people sometimes refer to it as the Bible of psychiatry, but it's effectively the set of guidelines and practices for diagnosing different forms of mental illness, at least used in the US. There are other diagnostic classification systems, particularly the International Classification of Disease, or ICD, that's more typically used in Europe, although there's a fair amount of crosstalk between the diagnoses that you see in the DSM and the diagnoses that you see in ICD. And the DSM's, sort of developed by a panel of psychiatrists as part of the American Psychiatric Association, and it's not without controversy, I think, as Susan was alluding to, but it is still the sort of mainstay of trying to bring some sense of structure and classification to individuals suffering with mental illnesses.
So it's the reference for diagnosticians, for people
That's
making diagnoses. And I would assume that it also has something to do with categories for insurance, but we don't need to go into that.
Yeah. I mean, it does relate to that. And it also relates to, in a sense, what, something like the National Institute of Mental Health is going to be, supporting research on, tying it to this sort of, in a sense, medical establishment that's trying to treat and help care for people with these disorders, how that works together and how that sort of operates is all part of this broader biomedical research ecosystem.
I mean, I also think that diagnoses, beyond being helpful for treatment and research, I mean, it also helps people find community. That, if there's a name for it, it doesn't have to define them, but it can help them find people with whom they may have some, shared experiences, or that they can learn from, or, teach. So I think that there are benefits to it as well.
Yeah. And getting to the right diagnosis can really help with that. It can really help create that community, and it can help you manage things in a way that is maybe hard to come upon just on your own recognizance.
Definitely. Denise asks, she says she was told that because her sister had bipolar disorder that she does as well. And she's curious about bipolar disorder or unipolar disorder, something else on the spectrum. And I think what I've heard you say is that not necessarily, but there may be genetic risk factors that are common.
That's right. And I think, whenever anyone's getting a diagnosis for anything, the most important thing is to evaluate the person in front of you. And that's what, I'm not a psychiatrist, but when I talk to my psychiatrist colleagues and friends, we talk about the sort of arriving at a diagnosis needs to be informed by what the patient is experiencing. And that really is front and center. That's the most important and critical component.
So I know you're not a psychiatrist, nor do you play one on TV, but you are involved in research and you need to understand about this. But if there is depression or bipolar disorder in your family, are there steps that you can take to affect the environmental side, so that the genetic side doesn't disproportionately impact the person?
Yeah. I mean, I think when thinking about how to cope, which I think is kind of what you're talking about, a colleague of mine's a kind of clinical psychologist, a woman named Janine Austin, and Janine's really nuanced and sophisticated thinker about this, and what they say is they really had this analogy of a jam jar, or sort of this, and the jam jar is a reflection of, in a sense, how well you're coping. And some of the genetic risk factors will fill up your jam jar a little bit, and then some of the environmental risk factors can fill up your jam jar a little bit. And when it overflows, when it becomes too much, that is when you might develop a manic episode, or you might have a difficult time coping. You might be in crisis, those kinds of things. And in a sense, the genetics is sort of one bit of things that might be filling up that gem jar, and then some of the environmental triggers. Maybe your sleep is getting a bit disrupted. Maybe you've had stress. Yeah, exactly. That, things at work or in your family are getting really stressful, and it's getting a bit overwhelming. And that can lead to overflowing your jam jar and sort of leading you into this slightly more fraught period. And, the degree to which individuals have genetic risk can vary, and the degree to which they have environmental risk also varies. But trying to dial back the stress, keeping them centered, helping them sleep, maybe getting them exercising, those kinds of things that every doctor is going to tell you to do. And it's really hard to adhere to their advice, but that advice is pretty consistent about, those kinds of slightly healthier habits can help you, manage the situation. And if it gets too much, then seek professional help. That's what that's there for as well. So, I think feeling powerless is something that you should try and avoid. And if you want to help your family and loved ones, try and identify those triggers, try and identify those coping strategies that help you manage, try and figure out what it is, what kind of support they need so that they can thrive. Those are still the most important things to carry with you throughout this, as we're trying to learn more about why it comes to be and how we might figure out other ways of helping to manage or treat the illness itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think sleep is really one of the, like a regular and adequate sleep pattern is one of the best defenses.
Yep.
Or ways to maintain good health with regard to bipolar disorder.
Yep.
So I would think that disrupted sleep may be a sign of an issue. Well, a sign of many issues.
Yeah, it can be.
All right. Are there other things that people should be watchful for?
I mean, sometimes if people get overstimulated, and also, it is a difficult time in the world right now. It is hard being a human these days. And so things like putting yourself on a news diet, shrinking the amount of sort of stressful information coming in, those kinds of things are, not going to work all the time, but for some people it seems to help. Things that are more familiar, more consistent, that kind of routine that you were talking about, Susan. I think, those kinds of things are encouraged, but, everyone's different, and what works for people varies, and, but also the professionals are there to help too. So do try and heed their advice to the best of your ability, even if it can be hard to follow doctor's orders. At least it can be for me.
I agree. I think it can be for everybody. And just in terms of the way we look at, maybe emerging symptoms of a mood disorder, so either depression or bipolar disorder, is that you have to know the person, you have to know their baseline, and so that you can look for changes. You can look for changes in how they're eating and how they're sleeping, and whether they're able to think, and if they're doing things that are erratic or impulsive. And I think all of those are indicators of either depression or bipolar disorder.
Yep.
You got a compliment here among many, but thank you for this helpful discussion. You would make an excellent psychiatrist. And it's great that you have a variety of colleagues to learn from each other.
It's very kind. Thank you, Denise.
So your next career. So in terms of, you said over the last 10 or 15 years, what do you think we've learned from psychiatric research, particularly with regard to bipolar disorder, in the last decade? And I think you've talked about a little bit of this, but commonalities among different psychiatric disorders, genetically speaking.
Yeah, so I think the first important message is the genetics is actually very complex. It's not 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 genetic effects. There are likely hundreds, if not thousands, of distinct, sort of molecular nudges that make you slightly more or slightly less likely to develop bipolar disorder. I think that's a really important observation for a few reasons. One, I think it speaks to how complicated the brain is and how complicated behavior is. Behavior is biology, right? There's biology there, and that's validated by the genetics. We wouldn't get genetic signals that are robust if there wasn't some biological meaning in there. And that biology is hard to interpret. We're still working on interpreting it. It's, sort of figuring out how to find the genetic effects was, the challenge maybe from, say, 2000 to 2010, 12 or so. And now we've kind of figured out how to do it, and we're scaling it up, and it's working, and we're finding a lot of genetic effects. But how to interpret those from a biological point of view, what they mean, how are they affecting cells in our body? How do those cells work together to create behavior, to create something like mood, something that we all have? But it's like, as hard as it is to think about consciousness and like cognition, there's also this whole sense of feeling and emotional landscape that's very different across people. Not, people have different experiences of mood and all of those kinds of things. And it's a hard thing to think about and quantify. And it's very different from quantifying something like, can you put all of the orders of making a BLT sandwich in the right sequence, right? Like that's a cognitive process that is very concrete. Mood is almost more complicated in that respect, but the genetics definitely supports the complexity of these phenomena. The genetics also, I think, says pretty clearly that the sort of diagnostic structure we have now, the ways that we put people into, in a sense, diagnoses, isn't how the genetics are operating. There are genetic effects that traverse diagnostic boundaries. So the same genetic nudge that might make you slightly more likely to have bipolar disorder could also be, more likely to develop schizophrenia, that there's a lot of genetic overlap in the underlying genetic risk factors between those two disorders. And it doesn't just stop with schizophrenia. There's a lot of comorbidity in mental health. Very rarely do individuals have just a single diagnosis, and is that diagnosis exactly the same all the way through life? It does happen, but a lot of the comorbidity, which is the co-occurrence of different distinct diagnoses in the same individual, or the presence of symptoms of multiple different forms of mental illness in an individual, is almost the rule rather than the exception. So, I think it's teaching us that the biology that we're trying to understand and the diagnosis and the diagnoses that we have right now are not a one-to-one relationship. It's a like many-to-one and one-to-many, probably in both directions. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything's just a soup. It's not quite that messy. It's a little more, there's some structure. There are things that are going to be more relevant or have a bigger impact on an individual's risk for bipolar disorder than it will for something like schizophrenia, and vice versa. Like these ideas of those genetic effects traversing the diagnostic boundaries, they don't necessarily have that same impact across the different diagnoses. And I think that's an important thing, that there is some amount of specificity, even if there's a lot of shared stuff too. So it's, kind of not one or the other, it's kind of both, and that's important. And then, I think on the promise side, sort of where we've advanced to now, we're starting to identify stronger genetic effects. So things that, most of the genetic effects that we've discovered thus far for something like bipolar disorder change your chance of developing bipolar disorder from, say, like 2% to like 2.05%, right? So it's a pretty modest impact on what's going on. But more recently, we've started to find things that maybe change your chance of developing bipolar disorder from 2% to maybe 20, 30, or even 40%. And, again, still not a guarantee. There are other things going on, more complexity, environment matters, all those things are still true. But these kinds of stronger acting risk factors from a genetics point of view, they might jumpstart biological inquiry. And I think that's, perhaps the most exciting part of the genetics is that, kind of robust genetic discoveries in many areas of medicine have led to transformative treatments. They've really changed the way we think about the biology, changed the way that we even approach trying to develop new therapeutic interventions. And so these genetic discoveries are, in a sense, the kind of starting point for pursuing that biology, for learning what it is that gives rise to something like a manic episode. Why do you lose the ability to sleep, or your speech comes out very rapidly, or you go on a shopping spree? How does your brain decide to do that? And how does that come to be? Like that may be more tractable now with some of these larger risk factors being identified to give us new ways of thinking about what it might mean to develop something like bipolar disorder.
Okay. So do you envision a time, or is it already, I don't think it's already available, but a way that, we can do some sort of blood test or other gene sample that will tell us whether these risk factors are at play?
Yeah, no, that's it's a good question. I mean, the hope is that we'll be able to get to objective measures, like you're talking about biological readouts, right? So if you think about something like heart disease, really big killer. And one of the biggest risk factors for heart disease is LDL cholesterol. You probably have heard of it as like the bad cholesterol, right? And the identification of bad cholesterol as like a big risk factor for heart disease, and then interventions to treat bad cholesterol and lower your level of bad cholesterol, have translated into some pretty impressive reductions in the rate of severe heart disease. Like, this has actually worked. And that's, in a sense, been an accomplishment over maybe 70, 80 years of work in various ways, partly informed by genetics, partly informed by evaluation, clinical research, all of those kinds of things. And, partly informed by biological inquiry, like understanding how LDL cholesterol moves around the body, what removes it from your bloodstream. Learning about those kinds of things was also an important step along the way to developing the LDL lowering medication that we now have. A lot of people are on statins. They really do reduce your LDL cholesterol. They reduce your risk of heart attack. You see that very, very clearly. And the hope is that we might be able to find something like LDL cholesterol for bipolar disorder, but I can't promise that. And that's the issue, because we don't have the skills necessary to interpret the genetic effects right now. We're developing them. It's the science, I think there's a great Richard Feynman quote: "Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts." And I think I try and carry with that to me at work every day, because part of doing science is trying to learn about the world around us and trying to learn new things. And so we have to invent technologies, invent new microscopes to study biology in different ways, and use that kind of genetics information to help us jumpstart that biological inquiry, to identify those potential things that might be a, say, blood test for bipolar disorder, or identify people that are at very high risk for bipolar disorder, so that we can maybe help them proactively develop coping strategies, stress the importance of, say, regular sleep patterns, really, encourage them to avoid drinking 3 cups of coffee at 10 o'clock at night. Like those kinds of things can have an impact on someone's individual experiences in this kind of way. And so maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. It's something that we are certainly actively trying to investigate and identify, but it's still in this sort of early days stage, I'd say.
I mean, the other thing with somebody in that situation you were just saying is that just having the knowledge and knowing where to turn and to be attentive to potential signs, and knowing what resources are available. I mean, I think that that's another benefit of knowing that you may have a higher likelihood of developing bipolar disorder or depression or whatever it is.
Yep.
I'm curious. I mean, I know that the research community around psychiatric genetic research is very collaborative, and I think that you've had a big hand in being able to manage a lot of data and do that kind of analysis. But I'm curious, like, has there been any effort to research non-European people?
It's a great question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. I see Gwen's comment about more inclusivity and diversity in studies about bipolar disorder and genetics is needed. Completely agree. So one of the largest efforts that I co-lead is something called the PUMAS project, or Populations Underrepresented in Mental Illness Association Studies. And in that effort, we've partnered with psychiatrists and geneticists and researchers in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Colombia, and Brazil, Mexico, to try and address the long-standing inequities in the study of the genetic contribution to these disorders. And there are other efforts out of the Stanley Center here at the Broad Institute that are also really targeting this idea of bringing the world's community together around this shared mission of trying to understand the genetic contribution to these illnesses and whether we can start to try and interpret that more universally for humans everywhere, rather than just the kind of European folks that have been most of the study participants up to this point in time. This, effort, PUMAS, is supported by NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, as well as by the Stanley Center, as well as other efforts such as the BD Squared initiative that's administered out of the Milken Institute. All of these different entities have come together to try and rally the world's psychiatric genetics community around this shared vision of working together across country boundaries to really do the best that we can possibly do in identifying genetic risk factors for these illnesses, with a hope to, again, learn about biology, but also maybe inform a little bit about, potentially clinical practice, depending on what pops out and what results, kind of make sense, whether there are those biomarkers, whether there are those intermediate traits that we think might be relevant. So absolutely agree that there's a lot of work to do, and we here are committed to that work, and that's something that's a really important component of everything that we're doing, is to try and ensure that the genetics revolution doesn't just get concentrated only in Europe, but is actually benefits people from around the world, because bipolar disorder is happening everywhere. And so there are people, suffering with these illnesses all across the world. And so it really is our, kind of ethical responsibility to do so. But it also gives us kind of additional scientific opportunities. There's genetic variation that's sort of more common or less common in different parts of our big human family tree. And by working across different countries and different groups of people and trying to really build that inclusive community of people rallying together around this shared mission, we hope to learn more about the genetic influences that may exist, and that may help us interpret that biology as well, and identify, risk factors that are, in a sense, universal, that the environment doesn't matter so much, and those kind of environment independent risk factors might be slightly more suited for treatment intervention. But it's a bit of speculation there, so we don't quite know, but it kind of stands to reason that if it's a risk factor across a lot of different kinds of environments and different kinds of places, then that might be a better point of leverage for trying to, at least, ease some of the symptoms people are experiencing with bipolar disorder.
Seems to me that that's something that an organization like the World Health Organization should be behind.
Yeah.
But I don't know all of what they do, but it just seems like they would have some access. How do you get people to participate in these studies?
So a lot of it is through sort of working with clinicians who are seeing patients and, consenting them. So trying to kind of reveal what we're going to do in the study, what research we're going to do, try and get them to understand those kinds of aspects of what they should expect out of the research, what they should be, what it's going to take to do that kind of research. And so the kind of study staff will, sort of introduce the consent forms, the goals of the study, the aims of the work, what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish. The participant has the opportunity to read through the consent. For some of our studies, we actually do a sort of assessment of understanding that they've actually grasped what's in the consent. And so there's like a little kind of quiz at the end to make sure that they are actually fully aware and understand what they are agreeing to participate in. And then, upon them signing the consent, we'll have them fill out, different questionnaires, collect information about their illness, what that looks like, how that works. And then, collect a sample, sometimes through spit, sometimes through a blood draw. And from those samples, extract the DNA from the cells that are in those samples, and then put that on a sequencer and read out what genetic variation they carry. And so that then gets matched with people who've been through a similar consenting process but don't have bipolar disorder, so that we can have a kind of comparison group to figure out what genetic variation matters and what genetic variation doesn't matter so much for contributing and shaping risk for bipolar more generally.
So you need to have clinicians on board so that you can get more people to participate.
Typically, yeah. Most of it runs through that.
That's good. So how do you foresee your research helping families affected by bipolar disorder?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the big hope for me is we map the genes, find those genes, interpret what they're doing biologically, learn something about the biology, and then once we get to learning about the biology, then we have the opportunity to start to think about developing new therapies and treatments that are targeted at exactly the biological perturbations that are giving rise to risk for bipolar disorder. There are treatments out there. They don't work in everyone. A lot of them carry side effects that people don't really like. Dry mouth and lithium, for example. There are a bunch of those different aspects about what our current medicine cabinet has and the sort of limitations and places that it falls short in managing illness or some of the side effects that come along for the ride, particularly when you get into some of the metabolic consequences of things like antipsychotics for people that are also dealing with psychosis in addition to maybe the mood disruption. Mm-hmm. So the hope is learn the biology. And if you can learn the biology and you can understand exactly what the sort of differences are in the biological system are, that can be used as a starting point for developing new therapies. And so my hope is that this hard work that we're doing on the genetics to understand what gives rise to people being more vulnerable for bipolar disorder can help us identify interventions that make people less vulnerable for bipolar disorder so that they either don't experience the episodes or the episodes are less severe or fewer and further between. All of that is part of the hope for the career arc. That's the ambition, at least. But it's a long road in front of us, no doubt.
Well, we will walk alongside you, and we will help caregivers on the, environmental side and the support side, and because, as you say, it's a soup, and there are different ways that we can affect people's well-being, and it seems like, for the time being, there's more that we can do on our side than you're able to offer on your side. but nonetheless, no, we're running out of time. So I really want to thank you so much, Dr. Neale, for this great discussion. I learned so much, and there's a lot of appreciation in the comments. So I'll share that with you. For people who are still with us, I also would like to extend our appreciation to Alchemies for their generous support of our bipolar disorder program. And there should be a link in the chat for you to order free copies of our Adult Bipolar Disorder Stories of Families and Hope brochure. We have funding to distribute, so if there are organizations in your community that you think will benefit, then let us know and we can send them out. Community clinics, anything like that. So please do fill out the form, and if for some reason you missed the form, just drop us a note at info@familyaware.org. And let us know where to send it and how many you want, and if you can, who you're going to share them with. So that's info@familyaware.org. I would very much like to thank you all for your time and your questions and your comments. And this will be available on YouTube for if you want to share it with anybody else. And I wish you a very good day. Thank you so much.